Riverside General Hospital, a symbol of excellence in healthcare within a thriving suburban community, was about to face a challenge greater than anyone could have imagined. Emily Harrison, a skilled black nurse, entered its ranks with hope and determination. Little did she know, deep-seated prejudices were lying in wait. As tensions escalated, a seemingly ordinary patient, Michael Preston, rested quietly in his hospital bed. But his presence was far from ordinary, and the power he wielded would change everything. What turns a nurse's struggle into the catalyst for an institution's transformation? Let's uncover this story together. Before we dive in, if you love stories filled with unexpected twists and moments of justice, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next inspiring tale. The fluorescent lights illuminated the gleaming hallways of Riverside General Hospital. Emily Harrison took her first steps inside, the soft soles of her shoes tapping lightly against the floor, yet the sound echoed loudly in the unnervingly quiet atmosphere. The air was heavy with the sharp scent of antiseptic, mingling with a palpable tension that seemed to hang in the space. Emily took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and held her chin high, silently, vowing to make a good impression on her first day. As she approached the nurse's station, the hum of conversations abruptly ceased. Eyes flitted toward her and then quickly away, as if avoiding any direct engagement. Emily felt the weight of each sidelong glance, the subtle chill of distant curiosity and unspoken judgment. She swallowed hard, gripping the strap of her bag tightly to steady herself, masking the flicker of isolation rising within. "Excuse me," Emily said, her voice calm, betraying none of the unease she felt. "I'm Emily Harrison, the new nurse. Could you tell me where the head nurse's office is?" A blonde nurse looked up, her blue eyes widening momentarily before a polished smile appeared. "Of course," she replied, her tone perfectly neutral, betraying no emotion. "Down this hallway, third door on the right." Emily nodded her thanks and walked away, keenly aware of the eyes lingering on her. Her footsteps echoed in the otherwise empty corridor. As she neared her destination, a door to one of the adjoining rooms swung open, and a tall man stepped out. His white coat, salt and pepper hair, and sharp gaze exuded authority, leaving no doubt in Emily's mind, this was a senior doctor. She offered a warm smile, her heart beating faster with hope that this could be an opportunity to forge a positive connection. "Good morning, doctor," she said, her tone genuine and steady. "I'm Emily Harrison, the new nurse. It's a pleasure to meet you." The man paused for a moment, his eyes briefly scanning her before his expression returned to one of cool detachment. "I'm Dr. Jonathan Keller," he said curtly. "I trust you've been thoroughly briefed on our procedures here." Emily opened her mouth to respond, but he continued, his tone as sharp as a scalpel. "We maintain very high standards at Riverside. I trust you're prepared to meet them." Without waiting for a reply, he strode past her, leaving her standing alone in the silent hallway. Emily unclenched her fingers from the strap of her bag, releasing the tension she hadn't realized she was holding. Dr. Keller's aloof demeanor felt like an invisible wall slamming into her, pressing heavily against her chest. But rather than let it overwhelm her, she drew in a deep breath, steadied herself, and adjusted her posture. Turning toward the door of the head nurse's office, she walked forward, her resolve intact. In the moments of waiting, memories surged through her mind. She recalled her mother's words when she first began her journey in healthcare: "You'll have to work twice as hard as everyone else, but never let them see you falter. You come from a line of strong women, and that strength runs through your veins." Those words had fueled Emily through late-night study sessions and long hours in the lab. But she also remembered the skeptical glances from certain professors and the whispered remarks when she excelled in her exams. Despite it all, Emily stood tall, graduating at the top of her class, proving herself to everyone who had ever doubted her. She tightened her grip on her bag strap, a silent reminder of her goals, and then knocked on the door. The office door swung open, revealing a stern-looking woman in her middle years. Her cold gaze swept over Emily in an instant, as though evaluating her thoroughly in mere seconds. "You're Miss Harrison, I presume?" the woman asked in an even tone devoid of emotion. "Come in. We have a lot to cover. I trust you'll be able to keep up." Emily stepped inside, feeling as though she were entering not just a new job but an actual battlefield. The air in the office, and throughout the hospital, felt heavy, tense, like the calm before a storm, waiting for a spark to ignite. Her first day unfolded like a whirlwind. Orientation sessions piled one after another, rapid-fire introductions, and an endless stack of paperwork kept her busy without pause. Yet, despite her efforts to fit in, Emily couldn't ignore the subtle but unmistakable signs of exclusion. Every time she approached, conversations abruptly ceased, only to resume in hushed tones as soon as she walked away. Her polite questions were met with curt, perfunctory answers, never expanding into real conversations. Smiles from her colleagues were thin and perfunctory, polite but devoid of warmth. By the end of her shift, Emily's body felt drained, as though every ounce of her energy had been sapped. Standing at her locker, she removed her name badge and began packing her belongings, but froze when she overheard hushed voices nearby. "Did you see the new nurse?" one voice whispered. "Yeah," another replied, laced with quiet derision. "I don't know what they were thinking. This place isn't for someone like her." Emily stopped mid-motion, her hand hovering over the locker door. Her heart pounded against her ribcage. The suspicion she had felt all day crystallized into harsh reality. She had hoped the coldness was merely first-day awkwardness, but now she knew she was facing a much harsher truth. This wasn't just a new job, it was a daily battle. Stepping out of the hospital, Emily felt the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. The cool night breeze swirled around her as she walked to the bus stop. Sitting on the hard plastic bench, she pulled out her phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing a familiar number. "Emily." Her mother's voice came through the line, soft yet strong, exactly as she remembered. "How was your day?" Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. But just hearing her mother's voice loosened the dam of emotions she had been holding back all day. "It was hard, Mama," she said, her voice catching in her throat. There was a brief pause, as though her mother was carefully choosing her words. Then, her mother spoke, slowly but with unwavering strength. "Emily Marie Harrison, listen to me. You worked hard to earn this position, and you deserve every bit of it. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise. You're not just doing this for yourself, but for every black girl who looks at you and dreams of standing where you are." Emily closed her eyes, letting her mother's words wash over her like a healing balm. "I know, Mama. I just didn't think it would be this difficult." "The things worth doing are never easy, sweetheart," her mother said, her voice softening but still firm. "But you carry the strength of generations behind you. Hold your head high, do your job well, and never let them see you weak. I believe in you." Emily clutched the phone tightly, as if trying to hold on to the warmth of her mother's voice. "Yes, Mama. I hear you." As she hung up, Emily looked up and noticed the headlights of a sleek black Mercedes slowing near the bus stop. Through the tinted windows, she recognized Dr. Keller. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment before the car smoothly drove away. Emily sat up straighter, her mother's words echoing in her mind like a mantra. Though the road ahead would be difficult, she knew she wasn't alone. With her family's strength and her own resolve, Emily felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. When the bus arrived, Emily stood up, taking a deep, steadying breath. The dim lights of the hospital in the distance seemed to hold a quiet promise of profound change. Emily had no idea that her presence would mark the beginning of a series of events that would transform Riverside General. But she knew one thing for certain: she would fight. The following weeks at Riverside General felt like a relentless trial. Each step Emily took through the hospital was like navigating a minefield, with every day bringing a new layer of tension. The initial cold indifference she had faced began to morph into more insidious behaviors, subtle, hard to pinpoint, yet undeniably damaging. Every morning shift came with its own dose of inequity, and Emily couldn't ignore the blatant bias in the way she was treated. Dr. Jonathan Keller, in particular, seemed to take pleasure in finding fault with her work. Nurse Harrison, his sharp voice cut through a bustling morning. The cold edge in his tone caused conversations around them to pause, curious eyes turning toward her. I trust you're familiar with our procedures here. We don't tolerate mistakes. Emily felt her spine stiffen, but she refused to lower her gaze. Her eyes met Dr. Keller's, and her voice remained calm. Of course, doctor. I can assure you I've mastered all hospital procedures. He raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth curling into a fleeting but unmistakably condescending smile. Good, because there's no room for excuses. I trust you understand that. She held his gaze, unwavering, refusing to let him see any sign of unease. As he walked away, Emily could feel the weight of her colleague's stares, silently measuring every word she had just spoken. The rest of the day felt like a gauntlet. Emily was assigned tasks no one else wanted to handle. Each time a challenging job was thrust upon her, she pressed her lips together, determined to prove herself rather than let the injustice weigh her down. Emily, can you take the patient in room 305? A coworker asked, her voice sugary but laced with thinly veiled insincerity. He's a bit difficult today. Emily knew exactly what that meant. Mr. Johnson was infamous for his sharp tongue and openly racist remarks. Still, she nodded. This wasn't just a job, it was an opportunity to prove her resilience. As she entered the room, Emily took a deep breath, her entire body bracing for the storm. What are you doing here? Mr. Johnson snapped as soon as he saw her. I told them I don't want a black nurse touching me. Emily's face remained composed, though her grip on the tray tightened ever so slightly to keep her hands from trembling. Mr. Johnson, she said, her voice clear and professional, I'm here to check your vitals and change your bandages. I assure you, you'll receive the best care from me. His hateful words continued, each one cutting like a knife, but Emily refused to let them pierce her resolve. Her hands worked with precision, carefully and efficiently, as she willed herself to ignore the barbs. When she stepped out of the room, she found herself face to face with Dr. Keller in the hallway. He stood with his hands in his pockets, his sharp eyes assessing her. Everything all right, Nurse Harrison? He asked, his tone feigning concern. We heard a bit of a commotion in there. Emily drew a deep breath, keeping her expression neutral. Mr. Johnson's vitals are stable, and his bandages have been changed. Is there anything else I can assist with, doctor? A flicker of surprise crossed his face before his usual smug demeanor returned. Let's hope you maintain that level of professionalism in all situations. We wouldn't want any complaints, would we? Emily nodded, feeling as though she had passed an unspoken test, one she should never have had to face. The remainder of her shift was a grind of relentless scrutiny. Every task was triple-checked, not because Emily doubted herself, but because she knew even the smallest mistake would be amplified. At the end of the day, Emily quietly packed her belongings in the staff locker room. The metallic clink of hangers echoed in the otherwise still space, until hushed voices from nearby broke the silence. Can you believe it? They keep making such a big deal about these diversity hires, one voice sneered. No way she can keep up with us. Emily's hand froze mid-motion, her fingers clutching the edge of the locker door so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded, each beat heavy and loud in her chest. A cold shiver ran down her spine, but instead of turning to confront them, she took a deep breath, closing her eyes briefly to steady herself. She gently closed the locker door, the sound so faint it was almost imperceptible. Walking away, Emily carried herself with determined composure. Her head was held high, but her slightly slumped shoulders betrayed the weight of the day's toil and the whispers that trailed behind her. Standing under the dim glow of the street lamp, Emily waited for the bus. The familiar sleek black Mercedes pulled up beside her, its polished surface reflecting the golden hue of the light. The window rolled down slowly, revealing the all-too-familiar face of Dr. Keller. His half-smirk cut through the cold air like a sharp blade. "Nurse Harrison," he greeted, his voice smooth but dripping with sarcasm. "Still taking the bus? What a shame. But I suppose that's all one can manage on a nurse's salary, isn't it?" Emily didn't have time to respond before the car's engine roared, and the Mercedes sped off, leaving her standing alone in the biting wind. Her hand tightened around the strap of her bag, her breath growing heavier as his cutting words echoed in her mind, a cruel reminder of the unfair challenges she faced every day. As she boarded the bus, Emily chose a seat by the window. The streetlights outside flickered past the foggy glass, casting fleeting shadows. Inside her, emotions surged like a storm, anger, hurt, and an unshakable resolve. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms, but instead of succumbing to the weight of her feelings, she reminded herself why she was here. This wasn't just about her. The next morning, Emily arrived at the hospital with a firmer stride. She had spent the night awake, replaying her reasons for becoming a nurse, to help people, no matter the obstacles. At the nurse's station, the atmosphere was different today. There was a hum of urgency, hurried footsteps, and voices calling to one another, excitement evident in their tones. Emily frowned, sensing the unusual energy. "What's going on?" she asked a coworker who was shuffling through paperwork. Forgetting their usual cold demeanor, the nurse replied with uncharacteristic enthusiasm, "We're getting a VIP patient. Apparently, he had a skiing accident and broke both arms. Everyone's eager to see him." Emily nodded, her curiosity piqued, but before she could ask more, Dr. Keller appeared. He strode toward her briskly, his expression serious. "Nurse Harrison," he said, his voice commanding. "You'll be caring for our new patient in room 412, Mr. Michael Preston. Skiing accident. I expect you to provide exceptional care." Emily nodded, her face showing nothing but professionalism. "Of course, doctor. I'll get started right away." As she entered the patient's room, Emily's attention was immediately drawn to the middle-aged man lying in the bed. Though his arms were encased in casts and his body immobilized, he exuded an undeniable aura of authority. His sharp eyes followed her movements intently, taking in every detail. "Good morning, Mr. Preston," Emily greeted, a gentle smile gracing her lips. "I'm Nurse Emily Harrison, and I'll be taking care of you during your stay here." Mr. Preston gave a slight nod, his gaze assessing her as she spoke. "Good morning, Nurse Harrison," he replied, his voice surprisingly steady and commanding given his condition. "Thank you. Honestly, I didn't expect a skiing accident to land me here like this." Emily returned his smile and began her work with her usual meticulous care. Yet, a question lingered in her mind. The importance everyone seemed to attach to this patient, it felt like there was more to the story. Was Mr. Preston merely a high-profile VIP? Or was there something else behind the anticipatory glances from the staff? As Emily began checking Mr. Preston's vitals and examining his condition, she couldn't help but notice his sharp, attentive gaze fixed on her. His eyes weren't filled with judgment or disdain, only curiosity, as if he were searching for something in her. Adjusting the foreline, she felt the heavy silence between them. "You seem quite skilled, Nurse Harrison," Mr. Preston finally spoke, his voice gentle yet laced with appraisal. "Have you been at Riverside for long?" Emily paused, caught off guard by his question. Turning her head to meet his gaze, she saw genuine interest in his eyes. For a moment, the world around them seemed to slow. "I've been here for a few weeks, sir," she replied carefully, each word chosen with precision. "It's been a rather unique experience." Mr. Preston raised an eyebrow, a glimmer of approval flickering across his face, as if he had gleaned something significant from her response. Ah, I see, he said, his tone light but still carrying a note of evaluation. And does this hospital live up to its prestigious reputation, in your opinion? Emily hesitated, her chest tightening. How could she answer that? This was a place where not everyone saw her for who she truly was. Her words felt trapped under the weight of her apprehension, but before she could respond, the door swung open. Dr. Keller entered, his face adorned with a smile so forced it bordered on theatrical. Mr. Preston, Dr. Keller here, he announced, his voice dripping with feigned warmth. I trust Nurse Harrison has been taking excellent care of you. We reserve our best staff for patients as important as you. Emily worked to keep her expression neutral, though her fingers tightened slightly at his words. She knew better, Dr. Keller had never regarded her so highly. But Mr. Preston, sharp as ever, seemed to detect the incongruity in the doctor's tone. Indeed, Dr. Keller, Mr. Preston said, his gaze shifting between the doctor and Emily. Nurse Harrison has been doing an excellent job. Emily heard him continue, I was just asking her about her experiences here at Riverside. For a fleeting moment, the smile on Dr. Keller's face faltered before he quickly recovered his usual demeanor. Oh, I'm sure she would tell you that everything has been wonderful. We take great pride in fostering a supportive and inclusive environment at Riverside. A slow burn of anger simmered within Emily, as if Dr. Keller's dishonesty had deepened an already unhealed wound. Yet, she maintained her composure, refusing to let her emotions surface. The next day, as Emily was changing Mr. Preston's bandages, a hushed conversation outside the room caught her attention. Her breath hitched, her hands trembled slightly, and the air seemed to grow heavier with every word she overheard. I don't care what Dr. Keller says, a nurse whispered. I don't trust that Harrison woman with our VIP patient. Who knows what she might do? I know, another voice replied, cold and dismissive. But we can't say anything. We'd just be accused of being racist. Emily's hands shook, not from surprise, but from the sheer weight of their words, each one hitting her chest like a punch, making it difficult to breathe. The betrayal and prejudice behind those whispers cut deep, leaving her feeling exposed and isolated. But Emily wouldn't let herself crumble. She drew in a deep breath, forcing herself to continue her work with steady hands, even though every movement felt unbearably heavy. Mr. Preston remained silent, missing nothing. His sharp eyes seemed to pierce through Emily's rising anxiety, reading her like an open book. Are you all right, Nurse Harrison? He asked, his voice gentle yet brimming with genuine concern. Emily forced a small smile, willing herself to appear composed. Of course, Mr. Preston. I'm just focused on making sure your bandages are changed properly. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, his gaze lingered on her, as though contemplating something deeply. After a moment, he finally spoke. You know, he began, his tone carrying a quiet wisdom, I've always believed that a person's true character isn't shown by how they treat their superiors, but by how they treat those they consider beneath them. Emily froze for a second, feeling a jolt of realization course through her. She had never thought about it that way, but as he said it, the words lit a small beacon in the darkness surrounding her. Thank you, Mr. Preston, Emily replied, her voice slightly shaky. But he didn't seem to notice. Instead, he looked at her with eyes full of understanding. In my life, Nurse Harrison, I've seen that people like you hold immense value in a world riddled with prejudice. Just then, Dr. Keller entered the room, interrupting their conversation. His overly cheerful demeanor felt as insincere as ever. Yet, as Emily watched him leave shortly after, she couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Preston was no ordinary VIP. His words felt like the opening of a door, giving her a glimpse of something she hadn't fully grasped before about Riverside. She didn't know then that his presence would mark a turning point in her life at the hospital. In the days that followed, Emily began to feel the weight of isolation pressing harder against her. The disdainful glances and whispered remarks had become a daily routine. Dr. Keller, emboldened by the lack of accountability, grew bolder in his attempts to undermine Emily. That morning, as Emily focused on reviewing patient files at the nurse's station, the deliberate sound of footsteps and Dr. Keller's pointed tone broke her concentration. "Nurse Harrison," he called, dropping a thick stack of files onto the desk in front of her with an air of authority tinged with a false sweetness. "I need you to handle these cases today. They're quite special. I trust you'll manage." Emily glanced down at the files, her fingers instinctively tightening around the edge of the desk. A quick scan told her the workload was nearly double that of her peers. Lifting her eyes, she met Dr. Keller's gaze, ensuring no hint of doubt or frustration showed. "Of course, Dr. Keller," she replied evenly, her voice unwavering. "I'll get started right away." Dr. Keller smirked as he turned to leave. "Let's see how she handles this," he muttered loudly enough for Emily to hear. That day was a whirlwind for Emily, leaving her no time to catch her breath. She moved from one demanding case to the next, each patient presenting a unique challenge. One required adjustments to a complex medication regimen, while another needed calming during a severe panic attack. Her body ached, each step heavier than the last as the hours dragged on. Still, her eyes remained focused, her hands steady and precise. She refused to let any fatigue show in front of her patients. Yet, the whispers she had overheard earlier in the hall echoed painfully in her mind, a constant reminder of the injustice she faced. As she hurried down the corridor in response to a call light, a quiet conversation from two nearby nurses caught her attention. "She's handling all the high-priority cases," one voice said, dripping with disdain. "It's like they're waiting for her to mess up." "Yeah," the other replied, softer. "But I have to admit, she's tough. If it were me, I'd have quit by now." Emily slowed her pace, her hands gripping the tray she carried. A simmering anger rose within her chest, quickly eclipsed by a pang of hurt. Those words confirmed that the bias against her was deliberate and that some of her colleagues were silently rooting for her to fail. Mr. Preston's room became a rare refuge for her. "Nurse Harrison," Mr. Preston said, his voice gentle yet tinged with concern. "You look exhausted. Is everything all right?" Emily lowered her head, adjusting the foreline, trying to mask the storm of emotions building inside her. "It's just been a busy day, Mr. Preston," she replied, offering a faint, weary smile. "Nothing I can't handle." Mr. Preston remained silent for a few moments, his gaze steady as though weighing his words carefully. Finally, he nodded slightly. "You know," he began slowly, his deep voice warm, as if seeking to offer encouragement, "there's a difference between simply getting through something and truly doing it well. From what I've seen, you always do it well." His words made Emily pause. She struggled to maintain her composure, but a lump formed in her throat as his kind words hit a nerve she had been trying to suppress. "Thank you, Mr. Preston," she managed, her voice trembling slightly. "I really appreciate that." As she turned to leave, his voice called out again, this time firmer, stopping her in her tracks. "Nurse Harrison," he said, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. "Remember, sometimes the greatest strength isn't in enduring but in knowing when to speak up." The next morning, as Emily entered the hospital, she immediately sensed the shift in atmosphere. The hurried footsteps, the tense faces, and the low murmurs all pointed to something unusual. She overheard snippets about an urgent surgery involving members of the board of directors and other prominent guests. Emily started her day feeling the weight of tension thick in the air. The rushed movements, anxious glances, and whispers about the upcoming surgery seemed to saturate the building with pressure. She was no stranger to high-stakes days like this, but something about today felt different. While reviewing patient files at the nurse's station, the deliberate sound of slow, purposeful footsteps approached from behind. Emily looked up to meet Dr. Keller's icy gaze as he stood before her. "Nurse Harrison," he said, his tone calm yet laced with an unspoken menace. "This afternoon, you'll be assisting in the urgent surgery. It's a very important case. I trust you're ready to handle it. Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second. Being chosen for such a significant procedure should have been an honor, but the way he spoke, coupled with his piercing gaze, made her wary. Of course, Dr. Keller, she replied, her voice steady as she maintained eye contact. I'll be prepared. As he turned to leave, she heard him mutter just loudly enough for her to catch, let's see how she handles this. This should be interesting. The hours leading up to the surgery passed in a blur. Emily busied herself with meticulous preparations, ensuring that every detail was accounted for. Despite her efforts, the skeptical glances from some colleagues felt like needles pricking at her composure. She could feel their doubt like a heavy fog surrounding her. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, don't let them see you weak. Drawing a deep breath, Emily straightened her shoulders and stepped into the operating room, determined not to let her emotions interfere with her work. The air in the operating room was thick with tension, compressed under the weight of invisible expectations. Everyone knew that every move was being scrutinized by the observers behind the glass window above, the board of directors and their esteemed guests. Emily kept her breathing steady, her hands moving with precise confidence as she handed instruments to the surgeons, her eyes darting to the patient to anticipate the next need. Then she noticed something unusual. Dr. Keller, typically confident and decisive, was hesitating. His hand trembled slightly as he prepared to make a critical incision. Emily's eyes narrowed as realization struck, something was off. Dr. Keller, she said, her voice calm but cutting through the stillness of the room like a bell. Could we consider approaching this from a different angle? The patient's anatomy suggests it might be safer. The room froze. All eyes turned to her. The silence stretched, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, Dr. Keller turned to look at her, his expression taut with a mixture of surprise and anger. Emily could feel her heart pounding, her breath quickening, but she held her ground. Her feet felt rooted to the floor, as though she were carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. After a brief hesitation, Dr. Keller nodded and adjusted his approach to align with Emily's suggestion. When the surgery concluded successfully, a wave of relief swept through the room, yet no one spoke. Emily noticed the glances from her colleagues, some filled with respect, others with envy or barely concealed disdain. As the operating room began to clear, Dr. Keller turned toward Emily, his expression tight and unyielding. Nurse Harrison, I need to speak with you immediately, he said, his voice low but icy. Emily followed him out of the operating room, her palms cold and clammy while her heart pounded fiercely. She knew she had done the right thing, but she was acutely aware of the potential repercussions of challenging someone like Dr. Keller. To her surprise, he led her to Mr. Preston's room. The patient lay reclined on his bed, his curious gaze shifting between the two as they entered. However, Dr. Keller paid no attention to Mr. Preston's presence. As soon as the door shut, Dr. Keller spun on his heel to face Emily, his face flushed with anger, his voice threatening to erupt. How dare you question my judgment, he hissed, his eyes blazing with fury. Do you even realize who you're dealing with? You're lucky I'm not firing you on the spot for your arrogance. Emily stood her ground, her body frozen under the weight of his outburst. Dr. Keller, she said, her voice steady but firm. I was simply doing my job. The patient's safety is my highest priority. Your job? Dr. Keller interrupted, his tone rising. Your job is to follow orders, not to think you're better than your superiors. People like you have no place in a prestigious hospital like Riverside. His words hit like daggers, cutting not just at her professionalism but carrying an insidious undertone of something far more reprehensible. Emily felt anger boiling inside her, her fists clenched tightly at her sides. But before she could respond, a voice unexpectedly cut through the tension. Dr. Keller, Mr. Preston spoke, his tone low yet commanding, resonating with an authority Emily hadn't heard before. I believe you've forgotten who you're speaking to and where you are. Both Emily and Dr. Keller whipped around, their eyes wide with shock. Mr. Preston, who was typically quiet and unassuming, now sat upright in his bed, his shoulders slightly leaning forward as if prepared to confront. His piercing gaze locked onto Dr. Keller, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy in the room like a suffocating fog. Mr. Preston, Dr. Keller stammered, his complexion shifting from flushed to pale, his eyes flickering with confusion and panic as he realized he had crossed a dangerous line. I didn't think you were awake. I apologize if I disturbed you. Oh, I'm awake, Dr. Keller, Mr. Preston replied, his voice low and commanding, each word cutting like a blade. And I've been awake for a long time. Long enough to witness the disgraceful way you and others in this hospital have treated Nurse Harrison. Emily felt her legs freeze beneath her. Her palms clenched tightly, and her breath caught in her chest. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. Mr. Preston, who had always been quiet and almost invisible, now loomed like a storm, stirring up everything around him. Dr. Keller blinked rapidly, his hand instinctively reaching to adjust his collar, as though it were suddenly too tight. Mr. Preston, surely this is a misunderstanding. There is no misunderstanding, Mr. Preston interrupted, his tone as unyielding as steel. What I've observed is a repeated pattern of racism and harassment. And that will stop now. Mr. Preston didn't need to rise from his bed, the way he sat, his head held high, and his penetrating gaze seemed to shrink the room around him. Emily could see clearly now, this was no ordinary patient. Dr. Keller swallowed hard, the smugness that usually adorned his face now replaced with palpable fear. Who are you? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. A faint, cold smile flickered across Mr. Preston's lips, though his eyes remained icy. I am the one who holds the future of this hospital in my hands. And, Dr. Keller, I have no intention of supporting an institution that tolerates racism and unprofessional behavior. The room seemed to thicken with tension, the air almost impossible to breathe. Emily could feel every beat of her heart, each inhale a deliberate effort to maintain her composure. The sharp knock at the door broke the oppressive silence. A nurse peeked in, her voice nervous and hesitant. Dr. Keller, the hospital administrator is looking for you. It's urgent. Dr. Keller hesitated, his eyes darting between Mr. Preston and the nurse, before he nodded stiffly, like a puppet on strings. We'll continue this discussion later. Nurse Harrison, you're dismissed, he said before hastily exiting the room. As the door closed behind him, the tension lingered. Emily remained rooted to the spot, her heart pounding, unsure of what to expect next. Nurse Harrison, Mr. Preston said, breaking the silence. His voice was gentler now, though it carried an unmistakable firmness. I think it's time I introduced myself properly. My name is Michael Preston, CEO of Liberty Healthcare Group. Emily stood frozen, her eyes wide in disbelief. Liberty Healthcare Group was a giant in the medical industry, renowned for its power and vast resources. Suddenly, everything Mr. Preston had said made perfect sense. Please, have a seat, he continued, gesturing to the chair beside his bed. We have much to discuss. Throughout their conversation, Emily saw a completely different side of Mr. Preston. He was nothing like any patient she had ever encountered. Every word he spoke carried immense weight, and as she shared her experiences of discrimination, he listened with unwavering focus. For the first time, Emily felt like a burden she had carried alone for so long was finally being lifted. Thank you, Nurse Harrison, he said when she finished, his eyes shining with determination. Your resilience is admirable. But it's time to change the system, so people like you don't have to endure this any longer. At that moment, a rapid knock at the door drew everyone's attention. The hospital administrator stepped in, her expression betraying clear unease. Though she tried to maintain her composure, her hands unconsciously clasped and unclasped. Mr. Preston, she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I understand you have some concerns regarding the hospital's practices. Please rest assured, we take these matters very seriously." Mr. Preston leaned back, his sharp eyes studying her carefully, as if weighing every word. Then, he raised an eyebrow, the gesture exuding both challenge and authority. "Do you, now? Because from what I've observed, the only thing being taken seriously here is an outdated system rife with discrimination." The administrator seemed to freeze in place. Her face turned pale, and her lips moved soundlessly for a moment before she managed to stammer, We have diversity initiatives." Mr. Preston leaned forward, his gaze cutting through her feeble defense like a blade. "Initiatives are not enough," he said firmly, his tone unyielding. "What this hospital needs is a comprehensive overhaul. And that starts with leadership." For the next several hours, Mr. Preston's steady yet commanding voice filled the room. He laid out his demands: a full investigation into discriminatory practices at Riverside, mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, and a complete reform of recruitment and promotion procedures. His eyes glinted with conviction as he emphasized each word, the air in the room seeming to grow heavier under the weight of his authority. When the discussion turned to Dr. Keller, Mr. Preston's voice dropped to a lower, sharper tone, every word carrying a palpable weight. "I expect his behavior to be thoroughly investigated. What I witnessed today wasn't just unprofessional, it was dangerous and could have directly jeopardized patient safety." The administrator nodded, her movements slow, as though the gravity of the situation was pressing down on her shoulders. "Of course, Mr. Preston. We will begin implementing these changes immediately." News of the confrontation spread through the hospital like wildfire. The hallways buzzed with whispers, anxious glances, and a mix of apprehension and anticipation. As Emily moved through the crowds, she felt their gazes following her. Some colleagues approached her awkwardly, offering stilted apologies. Others asked cautious questions about the upcoming changes. When her shift ended, Emily returned to Mr. Preston's room. The door creaked open to reveal him sitting upright against his pillows, fatigue evident on his face, but his eyes gleamed with a quiet sense of accomplishment. "Nurse Harrison," he greeted her, his smile this time warmer than she had ever seen. "I hope you don't mind, but I've nominated you to join the new Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Your experience and perspective will be invaluable as we reform Riverside." Emily froze, a wave of unexpected emotion crashing over her, momentarily stealing her voice. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Thank you, Mr. Preston," she managed, her voice slightly shaky. Mr. Preston shook his head gently. "No, thank you. Your resilience in the face of such adversity has reminded me why I entered the field of healthcare, to make a difference." As Emily stepped out of the hospital, the gentle glow of the sunset bathed the path ahead. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of lightness in her heart. Riverside was no longer just a place of inequity. It was becoming a symbol of transformation, and she was part of that change. What she didn't yet realize was that the changes Mr. Preston had initiated that day would ignite a wave of reform far beyond Riverside, rippling across the entire healthcare industry. Their story would inspire countless others to stand up and demand better. On Monday morning, Emily stepped through the hospital gates, her shoulders unconsciously tensing as she noticed news vans crowding the entrance. Reporters jostled for position, cameras glinting under the morning light. A few hurried toward staff entering the building, thrusting microphones forward, their voices rapid as they sought the latest breaking story. Inside, the atmosphere was stifling and unusually charged. Employees gathered in small clusters, whispering among themselves. Some turned to look at her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. As Emily approached the nurse's station, a scene made her heart clench. Dr. Keller, his brow furrowed and lips pressed tight, was being escorted by 2 security guards. Their eyes met briefly. In Dr. Keller's, Emily saw a flash of anger and fear before he turned away, his stiff gait betraying an effort to cling to his dignity. "Emily," a voice interrupted her thoughts. Turning, she saw Jessica, a nurse who had previously been cold toward her, walking over. Jessica's smile looked forced, her hands twisting nervously. "I just wanted to apologize," Jessica began, her voice hesitant. "For how I treated you. I didn't realize things were like this." Emily looked at her, feeling as though the apology no longer mattered. Still, she nodded, offering a faint smile to ease the awkwardness between them. Before they could exchange another word, the hospital's PA system crackled to life. "All staff, please report to the main auditorium for an urgent meeting in 30 minutes. Attendance is mandatory." Emily entered the auditorium, the air inside heavy with tension, like a fog pressing down on everyone. She found a seat near the back, her shoulders instinctively hunching as she felt curious glances from all directions. At the front, Mr. Preston stood amidst sharply dressed hospital executives. Though his arm remained in a cast, he radiated an imposing authority. As he stepped up to the podium, the room gradually fell silent. Emily could feel the collective anticipation, as if the entire room was holding its breath. "Good morning," Mr. Preston began, his voice resonating with clarity and determination. "For those who don't know, I am Michael Preston, CEO of Liberty Healthcare Group. Over the past week, I have been a patient at St. Mary's. During that time, I had the opportunity to observe the operations and culture of this hospital." He paused, his piercing gaze sweeping across the room, as though scrutinizing every corner. "What I witnessed was deeply troubling," he continued, his voice steady but firm. "A culture of discrimination, favoritism, and unprofessionalism, none of which has any place in modern healthcare." A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd, and some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Emily could feel the tension creeping through the rows, but she sat upright, her gaze fixed forward with calm resolve. "Let me be clear," Mr. Preston said, his voice rising in strength. "What happened to Nurse Emily Harrison is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a systemic issue that has persisted for far too long." Emily felt the weight of the room's attention shift onto her. This time, however, she didn't shy away. Sitting with her hands resting lightly on her lap, she found an unexpected wave of confidence rising within her. Mr. Preston pressed on, announcing a sweeping series of changes, a comprehensive investigation, mandatory diversity and inclusion training, and overhauls in hiring and promotion practices. When his speech turned to Dr. Keller, the room seemed to freeze. "Dr. Jonathan Keller has been suspended pending a full investigation into his conduct," Mr. Preston declared, his tone razor-sharp. The announcement sparked a wave of mixed reactions, shock and anger from Dr. Keller's loyalists, and visible relief from others. Taking a deep breath, Mr. Preston softened his tone slightly but maintained his resolve. "I understand that change is never easy. But this is not just the right thing to do. A workplace that values respect and diversity will lead to better outcomes for everyone, both staff and patients." As he concluded, the room fell into a brief silence, the air thick with contemplation. But then, Mr. Preston spoke again, delivering a final announcement that left Emily frozen in place. "And finally," he said, his voice unwavering, "I would like to introduce the person who will lead these changes, Nurse Emily Harrison. She has agreed to take on the role of Director of Diversity and Inclusion at St. Mary's." The room fell silent before a round of applause broke out. Emily felt her chest swell with a mix of emotions, shock, pride, and the weight of the enormous responsibility ahead. She hadn't anticipated that her small steps would lead to such a monumental turning point. But in that moment, she realized she was ready, not just to represent people like herself but to usher in a new chapter for Riverside. As Emily walked toward the podium, her eyes scanned the crowd. Familiar faces reflected a spectrum of emotions, surprise, respect, and, in a few, lingering traces of resentment. Yet, rather than shaking her resolve, those gazes only made her stride more determined. Standing before the microphone, Emily took a deep breath, her hands resting lightly on the wooden podium. "Thank you, Mr. Preston," she began, her voice steady yet strong. "And thank you all. I stand here not as an adversary, but as a colleague who believes in the potential of Riverside and in every one of you in this room." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the audience, letting her words sink in. "The road ahead won't be easy," she continued, her tone resolute. "But I am committed to working alongside all of you to create a hospital where every employee feels valued, and every patient receives the best care, regardless of where they come from." As she spoke, Emily noticed a shift in the crowd. A few staff members nodded, their expressions softening. Others remained silent, their faces showing thoughtful contemplation. Even those who had once been hostile now seemed to be listening intently. When the meeting concluded, Emily found herself surrounded by colleagues. Some extended hands with sheepish smiles, murmuring apologies. Others, while hesitant, made an effort to start conversations. The heavy tension that had hung over the hospital began to give way to a fragile but unmistakable sense of hope. Later that afternoon, as Emily prepared to leave the hospital, she spotted Mr. Preston near the exit. His arm was still in a cast, but his posture radiated ease. "Nurse Harrison," he called out, a glimmer of humor in his eyes, "or should I say Director of Diversity and Inclusion Harrison. How are you holding up today?" Emily chuckled softly, exhaling a light sigh of relief. "It's been a long day, Mr. Preston. I'm still trying to process everything. Honestly, it's a bit overwhelming." Mr. Preston nodded, his smile kind, though his eyes carried a serious edge. "I understand. It's a significant responsibility. But I want you to know that I have complete confidence in your abilities. What you've demonstrated isn't just resilience, it's grace under pressure. Riverside needs that, it needs you." They stepped outside together, the gentle glow of the sunset bathing the world in warm light. "You should know," Mr. Preston said, his voice quieter but firm, "what's happening at Riverside is just the beginning. I plan to implement these changes across all Liberty Healthcare Group facilities. And your story, Emily, will be the torch that lights the way for a revolution in how we approach diversity and inclusion in healthcare." Emily felt the weight of a new burden settle on her shoulders. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt a renewed sense of strength. "I'm ready, Mr. Preston. If we work together, I believe we can create real, lasting change." As they parted ways, Emily paused for a moment, her gaze fixed on the hospital behind her. So much had changed in just a few days, but this transformation wasn't confined to Riverside. It felt like the beginning of something greater, a chance to create meaningful, far-reaching change. She walked forward, her steps light, but her heart brimming with determination. The fight ahead would be long, full of challenges, and fraught with resistance, but Emily knew she was ready, not just to transform Riverside, but to contribute to reshaping an entire healthcare system where everyone is valued and respected. Under the golden glow of the setting sun, Emily stepped into a new chapter of her life, armed with a clear mission and an unwavering belief that what she was doing would make a difference. In the months that followed, St. Mary's General Hospital, under Emily's leadership and with Mr. Preston's steadfast support, began to emerge from the shadows of its old culture. Hallways once filled with whispers of prejudice now echoed with laughter and camaraderie. Diversity and inclusion training, initially met with raised eyebrows, heavy sighs, and skeptical glances, gradually began to change hearts and minds. Jessica, once aloof toward Emily, now frequently led group discussions, sharing her own story to inspire others. The investigation into Dr. Keller's conduct became a wake-up call. His dismissal was not merely a disciplinary action, it sent a powerful message: there was no longer room for discrimination and injustice. The changes at Riverside rippled outward, capturing the attention of the media and healthcare organizations alike. Emily received invitations to speak at prominent conferences. 1 year later, she stood before hundreds of attentive faces in a national auditorium, her heart pounding as she stepped up to the podium. 1 year ago, she began, her voice resonating with sincerity, I was a nurse on the verge of giving up. Today, I stand here as proof that change is possible. One voice, when heard, can make a difference. She shared Riverside's story, neither glossing over the difficulties nor ignoring the challenges. But she also spoke of the people who had changed, the hearts that had opened, and the new culture that had begun to take root. After the conference, Mr. Preston approached Emily, a warm smile appearing under the soft lights. Emily, he said, his voice calm and rich, you've come a long way since the first time we met. The two talked about the progress at Riverside. When the conversation turned to other hospitals implementing similar programs, Mr. Preston's eyes gleamed with a passion that had been dormant for years. You know, he said, pausing to look at her, that skiing accident was an unexpected turning point for me. But this journey, the one you've led, has reminded me why I started this work in the first place. Back at Riverside, Emily took in her surroundings. Jessica was waiting for her at the entrance, a bright smile on her face and a stack of files in her hands. The hospital was no longer just a workplace, it had become a symbol of renewal. Emily walked into the main lobby, her eyes drawn to a new mural. It depicted diverse hands working together under a light symbolizing hope. The words beneath it seemed etched into her heart, diversity is our strength. Inclusion is our commitment. Empathy is our mission. As she entered her office, her desk piled high with documents for new initiatives, Emily felt the weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders. Yet instead of worry, she felt a fire of determination burning within her. She smiled. Riverside's transformation has only just begun, she thought to herself. She knew change wouldn't happen overnight, but she was ready to face every challenge to ensure that no one in the healthcare system ever felt overlooked or devalued. As the sunset painted the sky in hues of gold, Emily understood that her journey wasn't just about work. It was a mission, a path toward equality, respect, and genuine compassion. What moment in Emily's inspiring journey resonated with you the most? Was it her unyielding resilience in the face of adversity, or the unexpected yet powerful impact of Mr. Preston's intervention? Share your thoughts in the comments below, we'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more uplifting stories like this one. Your support is the driving force behind our mission to spread these meaningful messages.